She ruled from the shadows. She whispered into the ears of emperors, made and unmade princes, and rewrote the rules of an empire built by blood. Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, the slave girl who rose to become queen, was dead. But her death wasn't the end. It was the trigger. As her body was lowered into the earth, cloaked in silks and secrets, the empire she left behind began to fracture. The women of the harem stood in silence. No weeping, no prayers, just cold stares and clenched fists. Somewhere in the crowd, Hurrem Sultan, Hurrem's daughter, kept her head high, but her eyes darted, watching, calculating. She knew the storm was coming. In the back, two men stood apart from the rest, Prince Selim and Prince Bayezid, Hurrem's surviving sons. They didn't cry either. They didn't need to, because while others mourned their mother, they were already preparing for war. There was no heir yet, no official successor, just two ambitious brothers and an empty throne. And deep within the palace walls, behind golden doors and velvet curtains, old alliances were breaking. Assassins were summoned in the dark. Bribes were whispered to eunuchs. Messengers rode at night. Everyone had waited for Hurrem to die, but no one was ready for what came next. Because when the Queen of Shadows finally vanished, her sons were left with one final lesson. In the Ottoman Empire, the throne isn't inherited. It's taken. With blood. The queen was gone, and the silence she left behind was deafening. Inside the Topkapi Palace, her absence spread like poison. For years, Hurrem had ruled the harem like a general commands an army. No concubine moved without her knowing. No whisper escaped her ears. Now, the harem was a war zone without a general. The concubines, once terrified of her, began to move like wolves sniffing the wind. Servants changed allegiances overnight. Old rivalries, buried deep under years of fear, rose to the surface. The velvet corridors were still lined with gold, but now, every glance, every silence carried a threat. At the center of this unraveling empire stood Hurrem Sultan, Hurrem's only daughter. Beautiful, intelligent, ruthless. She had her mother's eyes and her father's blood. But Hurrem wasn't her mother. She didn't have Hurrem's power. Not yet. She tried. Oh, she tried. She summoned viziers, manipulated court alliances, tried to protect her brother Bayezid from the storm she could feel coming. But even as she stitched together the remnants of her mother's empire, the cracks widened. Because in the wings, two princes sharpened their blades, not against outsiders, but against each other. Prince Selim, the elder, quiet, strategic, favored by his mother but underestimated by many. Known for his love of wine, but also for his patience. And Prince Bayezid, the younger, bold, charismatic, popular with the army, and dangerously ambitious. He had the fire of Mustafa, the tragic brother executed years earlier. But unlike Mustafa, Bayezid wasn't just loved. He was hungry. Neither brother would wait for their father, Sultan Suleiman, to die peacefully in his bed, because they both knew what their mother had taught them. In the Ottoman court, waiting was death. So they moved. Selim sent gifts to key viziers. Bayezid began building private support among the janissaries. Selim's allies whispered in the palace halls. Bayezid's agents slipped into the provinces. And Sultan Suleiman, aging, grief-stricken, and increasingly alone, watched as the empire he built began to rot from the inside. He had buried his beloved wife. But now he would be forced to decide which of his sons would follow him to the throne, and which one would follow Hurrem to the grave. Bayezid thought he was ready. He had the charm, the soldiers, the support of Hurrem Sultan. Even the people in the streets whispered his name with hope. In their eyes, he was the heir Hurrem would have wanted, bold, righteous, and unafraid. But what Bayezid didn't know was that his greatest threat wasn't a blade. It was a pen, held by his brother. Selim wasn't loud. He didn't march in parades. He didn't seek glory. He made deals. While Bayezid was gaining love, Selim was buying loyalty. And one by one, the men Bayezid trusted began to disappear. It started with rumors, quiet ones, that Bayezid disobeyed the Sultan's orders, that he raised troops without permission, that he was preparing for a coup. None of it was proven. But in the Ottoman Empire, truth didn't matter. Perception did. And Selim? He knew exactly how to twist perception. He planted letters, bribed officials. He made sure every whisper found its way to the aging Sultan Suleiman. The father who had already executed one son, Mustafa, now stared at Bayezid with haunted eyes. He saw not a son, but a traitor. Bayezid didn't understand the shift until it was too late. The Sultan ordered his sons to move to new provinces, separate, distant. Bayezid refused. That was the moment he signed his death warrant. Suleiman declared him rebellious, a threat to the state. And now, Selim had the one thing he needed most, legitimacy. The brothers went to war. Their armies clashed in the plains near Konya. Bayezid fought like a lion. His soldiers were loyal, fierce. But Selim had the full weight of the empire behind him. Viziers, generals, even foreign envoys, all backed Selim. And Bayezid, he was crushed. Bleeding, betrayed, and abandoned, Bayezid fled. He crossed into Persia, begging the Safavid Shah for refuge. He thought he was safe. But Selim wasn't done. He sent message after message to the Shah. Gold, promises, threats, until finally the Shah agreed. One night, without warning, Bayezid's tents were surrounded. No trial, no announcement, just silk cords and silence. Bayezid was strangled to death, along with his 5 sons, children. And when news reached Suleiman, he said nothing, because the man who once wept at the loss of Mustafa had nothing left to cry. The empire had chosen. Selim was now the last son standing. But he hadn't won the throne. He inherited a graveyard. It didn't happen on the battlefield. There was no clash of swords, no final speech, no hero's last stand. Prince Bayezid didn't die a warrior. He died in silence. After losing the battle to Selim, Bayezid fled east, into the arms of the Safavid Empire, the sworn enemy of the Ottomans. He believed the Shah of Persia would protect him. After all, they had a common enemy in Selim. At first, the Shah welcomed him with open arms, gave him gold, a palace, called him the rightful prince. But protection comes at a price. Behind closed doors, messages flowed between 2 empires. Suleiman, grieving yet furious, demanded justice. Selim offered bribes, threats, and promises. And slowly, the Shah began to change. He restricted Bayezid's movement, took away his guards, monitored his letters. Bayezid knew what was happening. He was no longer a guest. He was a prisoner. And then one night, just another quiet night in exile, the guards didn't bring food. They brought rope, silk cords, because Ottoman princes were not to be executed like criminals. No blood was to be spilled. That was the law. So instead they were strangled. Bayezid was 35 years old, a prince, a father, a son. They say he didn't scream, that he looked into the eyes of his killers and whispered a prayer. Then he died, choking on betrayal. But it didn't end there, because Bayezid had brought his sons with him. 5 boys, the oldest barely a teenager. He thought they would be safe. He was wrong. One by one, each of them was dragged from their beds. One by one, they were silenced. No mercy, no legacy, no bloodline. It was not an execution. It was an erasure. And the man who ordered it? Suleiman the Magnificent. The same man who had once cradled Bayezid as a baby. The same man who once buried Mustafa with trembling hands. Now he sat in silence, cold, detached, as news of the murders reached the palace. He didn't hold a funeral. He didn't speak their names. Because to survive as a sultan, he had to stop being a father. And so the greatest ruler the Ottoman Empire had ever known became something else entirely. A ghost. When the dust finally settled, there was only one. Selim, the last son of Hurrem Sultan, the only heir of Sultan Suleiman, the survivor. But there were no cheers, no coronation songs, no jubilation in the streets. Because Selim hadn't climbed to power. He had walked across a graveyard to get there. He didn't win a throne. He outlived his brothers. He didn't earn loyalty. He bought it. And as he stood in the imperial halls, once ruled by his mother, Selim realized something no one had told him. Victory is very, very quiet. He was alone. The court around him changed. Those loyal to Bayezid were executed or exiled. Hurrem Sultan, his sister, distanced herself, heartbroken and bitter. She had backed Bayezid until the end, and Selim had murdered him. Even his own father, Sultan Suleiman, now rarely spoke. The once mighty ruler of the empire, the man who led armies across 3 continents, had become a shell. Cold, silent, watching. It was said Suleiman aged 10 years in one. He barely looked at Selim. Perhaps because he knew. This was the son who had orchestrated the slaughter of his own blood. And perhaps he saw a reflection of Hurrem in Selim's ruthlessness. But not her brilliance. Not her charisma. Just her ambition. Selim was now crowned prince. Untouched. Unchallenged. But he was also unworthy. He was no warrior like Mustafa. No leader like Bayezid. He was known across the palace for only 2 things. His silence and his drinking. The court whispered, "This is the future of the empire?" Selim drank more. Spoke less. He started disappearing from meetings, slurring his words at ceremonies. But no one dared challenge him, because one lesson had been learned, loud and clear. In the Ottoman Empire, the most dangerous man is the one who's still breathing. And Selim? He was very much alive. For now. Hurrem Sultan is remembered as one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. A slave girl who rose to become queen. A mother who placed her sons at the gates of power. A master strategist who shaped the future of an empire. But behind the silk curtains and jeweled crowns was something darker. Because after her death, the very legacy she built collapsed into blood. She wanted Selim on the throne. She got it. But at what cost? Mustafa executed. Bayezid strangled. 5 grandsons wiped from history. And Selim? A ruler in name only. Haunted, broken, and hollow. Some say Hurrem won. That she bent history to her will. Others say she left behind a curse. Because every choice she made, every scheme, every betrayal, came with a price. She outlived her enemies. But she also outlived her peace. Her death didn't end the war. It started a new one. One where sons killed sons. Fathers buried children. And an empire that once stood proud began to quietly rot from within. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Hurrem Sultan. Not the power she held, but the silence that followed her name. If you found this story haunting, subscribe for more. Because history doesn't just repeat itself. It remembers.